Breaking news. Things are heating up behind the scenes in Miami, and we need to talk about some important developments because the Dolphins suddenly have a lot happening at once. But there's one piece of news that really caught my attention. Chris Bell is back on the practice field much earlier than many people expected. And man, this could be huge for the Dolphins. We know Miami needs young receivers to step up, and Bell was a player who showed serious talent at Louisville before suffering that ACL injury. Now the big question is, how much can he help this offense if he stays healthy? I want to know where you stand. Do you believe Chris Bell can become one of Miami's most important outside receivers this season? Or do you think the Dolphins still need another answer at the position? Write your opinion in the comments. And if you've been a Miami Dolphins fan for more than 15 years, hit that like button hard, because Bell's return isn't the only thing happening. We also have a major injury on the offensive line, a quarterback dealing with a groin problem, and new roster moves to discuss. But first, let's talk about Chris Bell. Let's get right to the biggest news, because this is the development that Dolphins fans have been waiting for. Rookie wide receiver Chris Bell has been activated from the non-football injury list, which means he can begin practicing with the Miami Dolphins. And considering where this conversation was just a couple of months ago, seeing Bell back on the field this early is a major surprise. There was a point during the offseason when the possibility of Bell essentially having a redshirt season was being discussed. Omar Kelly had raised the possibility that Bell might not return until November at the earliest. There was also speculation that October could perhaps become a realistic target based on some of the information coming from John Eric Sullivan and Jeff Hafley. But throughout this process, there were encouraging signs. Bell was apparently progressing very well in his rehabilitation and was ahead of schedule. Now we are in August, and instead of talking about whether Dolphins fans will have to wait until October or November to see him practice, Bell is already back on the field. That is a huge development. Bell tore his ACL on November 22nd, 2025, during his final season at Louisville. ACL injuries obviously require patience, especially for a wide receiver whose game depends on acceleration, cutting, balance, and confidence in his legs. The recovery timeline discussed for this type of injury is generally around 9 to 12 months, and several notable receivers have needed somewhere around that range before returning. Bell has reached this stage less than 9 months after suffering the injury. That doesn't mean he is immediately ready to play a full football game, and it certainly doesn't mean Miami should rush him. But being activated and getting back into practice represents a significant step forward, and the Dolphins appear to understand exactly how careful they need to be. Bell returned wearing a red non-contact jersey, which makes complete sense. The important thing right now is getting him comfortable again. Let him move around. Let him participate. Let him gradually increase his workload, and most importantly, make sure that his body is truly ready before putting him into full contact situations. There has already been discussion from Sullivan and Hafley about protecting Bell from himself, because a competitive young player is naturally going to want to get back as quickly as possible. Sometimes the player feels ready before the organization wants to expose him to the complete physical demands of football again. Miami cannot allow excitement over his progress to become a reason to push him faster than necessary. At the same time, the possibility of Bell appearing during the preseason suddenly feels much more realistic than it did before. The game this Saturday would appear extremely aggressive considering where Bell is right now. But Miami's final preseason game next Friday against Atlanta could potentially become something to watch. Maybe Bell progresses enough over the next several practices to participate more fully. There's even the possibility of seeing how far along he is during the upcoming practice schedule before Miami makes any decision about putting him into a preseason game. There are no guarantees here. The Dolphins don't need to force anything. But just having this conversation is remarkable considering the original expectations surrounding his recovery. And Dolphins fans should understand why there is so much excitement about Bell. Before the ACL injury, he was coming off an excellent season at Louisville and had established himself as a very interesting NFL prospect. The belief presented around him was that, without the injury, he could have been selected much earlier in the draft, potentially as a first-round player or at least an early second-round, top 50 type of prospect. Instead, Miami was able to select him in the 90s. That creates one of the most intriguing situations on this roster. The Dolphins potentially acquired a player later than his talent might normally have allowed because teams had to account for the ACL recovery. Now, If Bell can return earlier than expected and eventually regain the form he showed before the injury, Miami could have a very interesting young receiver on its hands.
His skill set explains the excitement. Bell is big, athletic, and physical. He has strong hands. He can block. He is difficult to bring down after the catch. There have even been very light stylistic comparisons to players such as Deebo Samuel and A.J. Brown because of that combination of physicality and ability with the football. Nobody should hear those names and immediately expect Bell to become either one of those players. That would put an unfair expectation on a rookie who is still returning from a major knee injury. The point of those comparisons is the style of football Bell can bring. He has the kind of physical traits that make him an interesting weapon, and those traits could fit an important need in Miami's receiver room. That is where this story becomes bigger than simply celebrating a player returning from injury. Look at the receivers Miami has been evaluating. Caleb Douglas has flashed. Malik Washington has been a frequent target for Malik Willis from the slot. But Miami still needs someone to establish himself as another reliable outside receiver. Jalen Tolbert and Theo Wease Jr. have not provided the answers so far, and that creates an opening for Bell. Bell could eventually become that X-receiver. Again, the Dolphins first need him healthy. Football in August is not worth risking the long-term future of a young player. But if Bell continues progressing and gets comfortable working with Malik Willis, suddenly this receiver group starts looking much more interesting. Imagine entering September with Caleb Douglas and Chris Bell emerging as two important young receivers while Malik Washington continues working from the slot. That is the kind of development that could completely change the feeling surrounding this position group. And Bell's return gives Miami something else that matters during this part of the year, another talented young player who can actually participate in the competition. Training camp and preseason football are about evaluation. Coaches need reps, quarterbacks need receivers. Young players need opportunities against NFL competition. Bell being physically capable of getting back onto the practice field gives the Dolphins another player to develop instead of having him spend the first months of the season simply rehabilitating away from football activity. That is why this is such encouraging news. But unfortunately, not everything happening with Miami's roster has been positive. While Bell is returning, offensive lineman Jamari Salyer has been placed on injured reserve. Salyer suffered his injury on the first day of training camp practice, and the full extent of the injury had remained unclear. Now the outcome is much more disappointing. Because he was placed on injured reserve before the season, Salyer will not be able to play this year. That is a real loss for Miami's offensive line depth. Salyer signed a one-year deal with the Dolphins and was projected to be a very important backup, particularly on the interior. In fact, he had the potential to be Miami's top reserve offensive lineman because of the flexibility and experience he could provide. Now Miami has to find another answer. The Dolphins recently added Caden Wallace through a trade, and his preseason debut at right tackle was very encouraging. Wallace gives Miami another option and helps the overall depth of the offensive line, but Salyer's absence still creates a